So we got big news. We've got a job offer in D.C.
Wow.
I'm not sure though, so we kind of wanted to get thoughts.
Wow, Washington, D.C. Are you ready for that, Anna?
Hopefully we'll live in the suburbs so that I won't have quite as big of a traffic shock.
Moving to a big city, there's, a lot of logistical challenges. It's very expensive. There's a lot of things that are big iterations that, we have to think through. Are they
350 pages of emails and messages between Josh Duggar and Anna Duggar from Washington County Detention Center have been obtained through a public records request. And what is inside those pages confirms everything that sources have been saying privately for years about how Josh really feels about his family, how Anna has been manipulated into believing a false narrative, how Jim, Bob, and Michelle were saying one thing publicly and something completely different privately, and how the siblings were fighting behind the scenes while presenting a unified front to the world. And I want to walk you through the most significant and revealing moments in these documents, because they paint the most complete and honest portrait we have ever had of what is really happening inside the Duggar family behind closed doors. The first thing that jumps out immediately from these messages is the way Josh communicates with Anna. There is a pattern of love bombing that runs throughout the entire correspondence, where Josh repeatedly praises Anna, tells her how great she is, how the enemy is attacking them, how they need to stay strong together, and how she is the only one who truly understands and supports him. And this is a textbook manipulation pattern where someone who has caused tremendous harm to another person keeps that person emotionally bonded through cycles of praise and spiritual framing that make leaving feel like a betrayal of God, rather than a reasonable response to being deceived. On New Year's Eve of 2021, Anna wrote Josh a message that is one of the most heartbreaking things in these entire 350 pages. She wrote that what looked like one of the most promising and happy years of their lives together turned out to be the hardest by far, that the next year would be spent entirely separated, with it just being the beginning. And then, she wrote something that tells you everything about how completely Josh had manipulated her. She asked, "Where is justice for Caleb and the Williams boys running free?" Meaning Anna genuinely believed at this point that Caleb Williams was responsible for what Josh had been convicted of, that her husband was innocent, and that the real perpetrator was walking around free while her innocent husband sat in detention. And that belief, that completely false belief, was not something Anna arrived at independently. It was something Josh fed her deliberately and systematically through every communication they had. Because keeping Anna convinced that he was innocent and that someone else did this was the only way to keep Anna in his corner, keep her managing his public image, keep her raising his children under the Duggar umbrella, and keep her as a resource he could control from behind bars. On February 1st of 2022, Josh sent Anna a message that contains one of the most startling admissions in the entire document. He wrote that he had measured success wrong all his years, that he had been focused on money and getting to the next level like a video game financially, that the materialistic focus in his family was not balanced enough, and that God had financially pulled the rug out from under them to refocus them on his will. And then, and this is the part that should make everyone sit up, he wrote that he was convinced God wanted him to work in politics, still specifically, in criminal justice reform. Meaning that Josh Duggar, sitting in detention after being convicted of possessing child sexual abuse material, was actively planning his political future and framing his conviction as a divine redirection toward criminal justice advocacy. And that is not the thinking of a man who has any genuine understanding of the gravity of what he did or any genuine remorse for the harm he caused. Anna's emails reveal a woman who is under extraordinary pressure and who has genuine grievances of her own. And in a February 2202 email, she wrote to Josh that his parents were nice and kind in quotes, but had been tearing him down for decades, thinking it was okay because they did it in a sweet tone. And she urged Josh to open the areas of his heart that had been shut since childhood and let God heal each individual pain. And while there is something genuinely empathetic in Anna's framing of Josh's childhood pain, the fundamental problem is that she is directing all of her compassion and analytical energy toward understanding Josh as a victim of his upbringing, rather than as a perpetrator who made choices that harmed real people. And Josh is actively encouraging that reframing because it serves his interests perfectly. Josh's feelings about his family members are expressed with startling directness in these messages, and he has particular contempt for Austin Forsyth and Derick Dillard, referring to them by initials, and telling Anna in one message that both of them have unresolved conflicts, specifically referencing that Derick's father is dead and that Austin's brother was in prison, and essentially suggesting that their criticism of Josh stems from their own unresolved trauma, rather than from the perfectly reasonable position of two men whose wives were victimized by Josh. And what makes this so revealing is that Josh is simultaneously demanding empathy for his own childhood wounds while weaponizing the wounds of others against them. And that is one of the clearest demonstrations of malignant narcissism you will find anywhere in these 350 pages. Josh also reveals in these messages that he felt completely abandoned and shunned by his family after the 2015 revelations about what he had done to his sisters, writing to Michelle that after everything became public in May 2015, he and Anna were cut off from public view on television and really shunned publicly and kept at arm's length by most of the family, that no one banded together to stand with them, that it was all as if there were 18 kids and life went on, and that he felt the family was placing PR and public image above family relationships. And while there is something almost sympathetic in the picture of a man feeling abandoned by his family, the critical context is that the family distanced themselves, not because of some arbitrary cruelty, but because Josh had been publicly exposed for molesting his sisters as a teenager, and the family's response was not to distance themselves out of moral clarity, but to distance themselves to protect the show and their public image, which Josh himself correctly identifies. Meaning the Duggar family's problem with Josh was never what he did, it was that people found out about what he did. And that distinction is one of the most damning things in this entire document, because it tells you that the family's values have never been about protecting victims or holding perpetrators accountable, but about managing perception and protecting the brand. In one of the most significant emails Josh sent to Michelle, he laid out a long list of grievances about his parents' handling of his situation, and buried within that list is something that deserves very serious attention. He describes Anna warning him and his parents about Caleb Williams's behavior around the house, specifically that Caleb was making crude sexual jokes, displaying what Josh describes as childish behavior with sexual innuendo, and that Anna wanted Caleb gone once his behavior became apparent, but that Jim Bob overruled her and told Josh that in light of Josh's own choices, they should be more compassionate toward Caleb, and that Jim Bob personally vouched for Caleb, saying he was not going to do anything, and that the fear of God had been put in him. And a source who was at the Duggar house during this period confirmed something independently disturbing, that Caleb Williams would sit beneath the open catwalk staircase in the house and attempt to look up the skirts of minor girls, and that he would try to flirt with and seduce underage girls while at the house, and that all of this was permitted in an environment where Jim Bob Duggar was the patriarch and the self-appointed moral authority. Now Josh is using Caleb as a scapegoat, and there is no forensic evidence that Caleb committed the crimes Josh was convicted of. The evidence was overwhelming and specific to Josh. But the separate question of what Caleb was doing in that house and whether Jim Bob knew about it and chose to do nothing about it is a legitimate and serious question that investigators should be asking, especially given that Caleb Williams has since been convicted of similar crimes against a minor. Anna's emails show that by June of 2022, she was genuinely struggling under the weight of her situation and was increasingly frustrated with Jim Bob and Michelle, writing to Josh that she felt like the world was closing in on her, that there was constant pressure, judgment, and condemnation on all sides, that his parents had moved on with their own lives and other children who were doing great, while she was left responsible for everything, and that she was making Jim Bob and Michelle's dinner, washing their laundry, mopping their floors, and doing their dishes, while being constantly judged, criticized, and threatened with being forbidden from the house if she had anything less than a perfect reaction. And she wrote with devastating clarity that she had served like no other daughter-in-law, and probably more than any other daughter besides Jana, and there was nothing to show for it. No love, little to no support, just constant criticism. While Jim Bob and Michelle went on celebrating themselves as important people with important things to do. And what this reveals is that Anna Duggar was trapped in an almost impossible situation, trapped in a marriage to a convicted sex offender, trapped in financial dependence on his family, trapped in a home where she was expected to perform endless domestic labor while being treated as less than, trapped in a belief system that gave her no legitimate path out, and trapped in a false narrative that her husband had constructed to keep her loyal. And the tragedy of Anna Duggar is not that she is a bad person, but that she is a person who has been so completely shaped by the same system that produced Josh that she does not have the tools to see her own situation clearly or to make choices that would genuinely serve her own well-being and the well-being of her children. Josh's most revealing email about Jim Bob comes after his sentencing, when he wrote that he could now see how no one else, including Pops, really cared about him to the point that they did not even believe in him, and thought he was the monster portrayed by the government. And he wrote with real bitterness that he had put way too much faith in Pops's opinions, and that Jim Bob was now off attacking him to others, while not standing by him and refusing to humble himself and see his own role in all of this. And he specifically called out Jim Bob's role in decisions related to Caleb Williams, the car lot, finances, and Reformers Unanimous, which sources indicate is the R in the initials he uses. And what this shows is that Josh Duggar privately understands that Jim Bob's influence over his life was controlling and manipulative even while he was publicly performing the role of the grateful obedient son. And that understanding came too late and was filtered through a narcissistic lens that still refused to place primary responsibility for his own choices on himself. Now I want to address the broader context of what these emails reveal about the Duggar family system as a whole, because what emerges from 350 pages of private communication is a family where public statements and private reality are almost completely disconnected, where the siblings who were publicly presenting as supportive and unified were privately shunning Josh until it became publicly known, and then distancing themselves not because of moral conviction, but because of how it looked, where Jim Bob was privately telling Josh he had done terrible things while publicly insisting to everyone else that Josh was innocent and being persecuted, where Anna was being used as a messaging tool, with Josh directing her from detention to use her platform to post specific messages and confront specific people, and where the entire machinery of image management was running at full speed even as the family privately fell apart. And the section of Josh's emails where he reflects on his childhood and what was done, or not done, for him when he was a teenager, is one of the most uncomfortable parts of this entire document. Not because it generates sympathy for Josh, but because it is accurate in its assessment of what his parents failed to do. Because Josh should have been turned into police when what he did to his sisters was discovered. He should have faced real consequences in the juvenile system. He should have received genuine clinical therapy from qualified professionals. And instead he was sent to live in a trailer with a family friend, where he dug out a pond for 30 days with no therapeutic intervention whatsoever, and then sent to Indianapolis, where he did construction work as free labor for the IBLP with no therapy, no accountability, no genuine intervention of any kind. And the research is clear that minors who offend and receive proper therapeutic intervention are significantly less likely to go on and offend as adults, meaning the window to break the cycle existed. And Jim Bob and Michelle chose to use that window not for genuine intervention, but for damage control and image management. And then they moved on and kept running their television show and kept making money and kept building their platform on a foundation that they knew was rotten. And when it all finally collapsed publicly, they abandoned the son, whose trajectory they had shaped, and pretended they were as shocked as everyone else. These 350 pages do not generate sympathy for Josh Duggar's crimes. Nothing could or should. But they do generate something important, which is clarity. Clarity about how this family operates. Clarity about the gap between public performance and private reality. Clarity about how Jim Bob Duggar's control and manipulation shaped every person in his orbit, including the son who is now in federal prison. And clarity about what happens when a family chooses image over accountability for decade after decade after decade, until the weight of everything they have been hiding finally becomes impossible to carry.